Sequels, and then in particular direct sequel with the same protagonist unlike new standalone games, will always face certain expectations. The most notable being the pressure to improve what didn't work in the original and avoid ending up in its shadow. No doubt, the Legend of Zelda series is a prime example, as direct or nearly direct sequels on the same systems have actually been a mixed bag over the years. Zelda 2 and Phantom Hourglass did not match the quality of Zelda NES and The Wind Waker, while Majora's Mask in some people's eyes even surpassed Ocarina of Time. So what are traditional traits of a sequel starring the same protagonist that it will be most rewarding to those who played the original game? Naturally, the Zelda team with series producer Eiji Aonuma and director Hidemaru Fujibayashi expect that people who will play Breath of the Wild 2 first played Breath of the Wild. The darker and cryptic tone and contrasting setting, story, gameplay, and with it difficulty are clear indications of what is next for the franchise. Similarly to how Zelda 2 was a harder game than Zelda 1, and Majora's Mask was harder than Ocarina of Time. But let's take the difficulty argument another step by going into the structure of Breath of the Wild and how Breath of the Wild 2 is likely to differ from it.
Breath of the Wild was a game centered around the theme of redemption. Link starts out at his absolute weakest/lowest point after failing in battle and being resurrected 100 years after with a mere 3 hearts, no armor, no weapons, and no memory. Breath of the Wild was, in its first hours, hard and unforgiving. In fact, so hard that most enemies could take you out in just 1 or 2 hits. However, this was a difficulty that didn't evolve as we got stronger through more stamina and heart containers after exchanging spirit orbs for these better and upgraded armors, stronger weaponry like the Master Sword, and most importantly, Mipha's grace and recipes that could fully restore your health by cooking up a single hearty truffle. Soon enough, many of us were eating even the strongest Lionels for breakfast with the fully upgraded Barbarian set, Zonai. And this level of progression was much like Zelda 1, very tough in the beginning and then became more and more manageable, at least in the overworld. To credit the original Zelda, it had much harder final dungeons than Breath of the Wild. Yes, traditional dungeons are better and more challenging than the Divine Beasts.
Back in 1986 and 1987, The Legend of Zelda was equally successful as Breath of the Wild was in 2017. Which brings us over to Zelda 2, the black sheep in the official Zelda family. Zelda 2 was no doubt a much more demanding game than the original. Instead of starting out hard and then gradually becoming more manageable, it started out manageable and then punched straight into your face with Death Mountain, and then continued to beat you all the way to the final boss, Dark Link. Obviously, the game had many flaws and is regarded by many as a lesser Zelda experience than that of Zelda 1, but I believe that is exactly why the Zelda team wants Breath of the Wild 2 to offer the same challenge that was found in Zelda 2. That is to say, where the game starts out challenging and gets more and more difficult as the game progresses. Each area you progress into throws new and tougher obstacles, enemies, dungeons and bosses. Breath of the Wild left us with a classic Zelda ending. Link and Zelda in unison defeating Dark Beast Ganon, just as what was the case with Ganondorf in Ocarina of Time, The Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. The story could end here. Instead, just as what was the case in Zelda 1, we're in for another adventure, in Hyrule, but one that will be very different to anything we have seen in the Zelda series thus far, even compared to the dreadful and outer world experience that was Majora's Mask.
The reason is simple. Never before have we started out with the same Link and Zelda at their prime, potentially 30 hearts, awful stamina, the champion tunic combined with the Hylian tunic, and the fully powered Master Sword. Obviously, we are certain that we will not start out with 30 hearts, and that we will have to build us up again once to stand any chance of bringing down Mummy Ganondorf. Ocarina of Time Zelda had an important role to fulfill in Majora's Mask, but even then, she was just a flashback, a memory of times gone. In Breath of the Wild, we fought the entire game to once again be with Zelda, and when their future is now threatened, Ganondorf knows exactly what Link and Zelda are coming for. The only difference this time around is that he's hunted by a right-handed Link. However, even this is subject to change to the traditional duel for the Triforce, as Link's right hand might be incapacitated due to the green Zonai power he gains at some point in the game. This also seems to be a likely turning point, as Ganondorf is likely to, once again, infest Hyrule after breaking free from his imprisonment. So, what can we expect on top of the existing enemies of Hyrule? Well, with the Guardians possibly gone and Hyrule Castle rising, it could be that Dark Nuts might make a return, and as we all know from The Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, they are no joke in 3D Zelda. Just imagine how crazy these enemies could be with the sophisticated enemy AI seen in Breath of the Wild.
But the Dark Nuts are only the beginning, as we need way more enemies on top of different forms of keys, choo-choos, octoroks, bokoblins, moblins, lizalfos, wizrobes, peblets, Lionels, and the Yiga. Yes, you know something is wrong when you can name all non-mechanical, regular, non-overworld and dungeon boss enemies in Breath of the Wild in one regular sentence. Luckily, this is likely to change in Breath of the Wild 2, with a long list of Zelda enemies waiting for their return and a number of potential foes making their debut. There's no doubt that a Zelda game that has been quoted by series producer Eiji Aonuma to be darker than Majora's Mask will not hold back. Specifically, since Hyrule needs to be filled out with new content and new enemies to bring new life and threats to areas we know after spending hundreds of hours inside Breath of the Wild. I'm not going to list any enemies here, as we simply don't know what the Zelda team will pull out, but there's no doubt that some underused elements from Breath of the Wild will shine in the sequel. A good example of this is the Yiga clan, which we will go much more in depth next week. They were a complete farce in Breath of the Wild, and you realize quickly that the joke was deliberate based on how we humiliated Master Koga with little to no effort. Even so, Master Koga's death ironically turned the Yiga into a bigger threat, bringing the Blade Masters out into the fields and forests of Hyrule.
So perhaps as we will study next week, the Yiga could come under the command of their new leader Ganondorf, mobilize and this time become a serious threat to all of Hyrule. Obviously, it is a given that Ganondorf will spawn some more menacing foes across Hyrule, and if the Blood Moon is truly history, then these encounters better be worth remembering, as we will not see many of them again. This also goes for the overworld bosses, which was one of the best new inclusions found in Breath of the Wild. We just wish that, like with the enemies, there was a greater variety of them. And Breath of the Wild 2 might introduce more overworld bosses which will be even larger and more terrifying than the Hinoxes, Moldugas, and Taluses. Nevertheless, the overworld has traditionally in Zelda been reserved for smaller enemies, and the strongest and most challenging enemies have been found exclusively within dungeons, not as obstacles, but Ganondorf's tools of killing. Breath of the Wild never offered us that experience of fright with Skulltulas dropping down from the Divine Beast, or a Stalfos launching at us with a mighty sword and shield. These are enemies that made the adult portion of Ocarina of Time stand out. Same with the mini-bosses such as the Iron Knuckles, Death Hand, and the greatest challenge of them all, Dark Link. Breath of the Wild did not have a single mandatory dungeon mini-boss to beat prior to facing the dungeon boss. With a mighty return of dungeons and their more expansive nature, it's likely that the greatest challenges, both from a combat and puzzle standpoint, will be found in the temples and dungeons in Breath of the Wild 2.
Since Breath of the Wild did introduce few new regular organic enemies beside the different types of mechanical guardians, it appears that Breath of the Wild 2 might be more ambitious in this field and provide the challenge that such a dark title deserves. Speaking of darkness, what is more fitting than ending our exploration of high difficulty in Breath of the Wild 2 than going deep underground Hyrule, where we'll find everything that was too difficult for an introduction to open-air Zelda in Breath of the Wild 1. That is to say, environmental or even gas hazards that are more than just rolling rocks. After all, there are no lightning strikes to hit us on the ground, but with the reveal trailer having so much emphasis on underground areas in Princess Zelda, we have to wonder how difficult and scary this area could be, with more linear paths that will force us into combat situations and often require us to put our greatest skills to the test. Just like in dungeons in the past, the underworld could be the massive dungeon that the development team talked about back in 2014 for Zelda Wii U, later Breath of the Wild. A set of massive caves with man-made structures leading to key objectives, and put in our way a long list of most terrifying and challenging enemies, mini-bosses, and bosses that we have seen in a 3D Zelda game.
That is how you surpass Breath of the Wild. That is how you surpass even Majora's Mask, to create a Zelda experience like never before, where the underground more even than the overworld of Hyrule can kill you. And that is more terrifying. As we stated at the beginning, sequels need to stand out and go beyond what the original established, in terms of story, setting, and gameplay. And that is just what Breath of the Wild 2 is likely to do with the new scary and difficult enemies that will be worthy of being a sequel to one of the hardest Zelda games in the series. only this time with the difficulty growing gradually until we reach the final dungeons, and finally the ultimate battle against Ganondorf that Monk Mars Koshia tested us for. The no doubt most difficult duel in the series. The question is, will we be ready for it when the game drops? We have a dedicated video on the topic of Breath of the Wild 2's Undergrounds, so make sure to check it out. But you know what? There is actually another way to make Breath of the Wild 2 more difficult throughout and give us the player the possibility to adjust the difficulty according to preferences whenever we like.
And this is something we'll talk about in depth in our next video, where Joseph Ferris will be back for a very special collab regarding Breath of the Wild and Witcher 3 on Nintendo Switch. So make sure to leave a like, subscribe and press that shiny bell for all notifications to not miss our upcoming videos on Breath of the Wild 2, Zelda, Nintendo Switch and more. We are hitting now very quickly 220,000 subscribers, but we have already targeted our site towards 225,000 and then 250,000 subscribers. Finally, a big thanks to all our patrons and in particular our royal producers on patreon.com/commonrun. We will see you in the next one.